Good afternoon. I'm Ivo Dalder, the President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us for this vitally important conversation. In the past few weeks, our country has been convulsed by deep pain, real anger, and growing fear as we witness the brutal murder of George Floyd at the hands of white police officers whose job it is to serve and protect us all. Floyd's murder was outrageous, but it was hardly unique. Just last February, Ahmaud Arbery was a victim of a modern-day lynching. In March, Breonna Taylor was shot and killed by police in her own home. And George and Ahmaud and Breonna are only the latest names on an all too long and all too unacceptable list of Americans who lost their lives for no reason other than that they were Black. The underlying cause of these deaths is clear. It is racism. For all too many in our society, Black lives seem to matter less. Of course, this is nothing new. It is a systemic problem that has been at the core of America for 400 years. And it was part of this country's founding nearly 250 years ago. In a nation of immigrants, most, including myself, came here by choice. But Black Americans came here in chains. And generations after they were sold into slavery, even as their labor and hard work built this great land. This past few months has seen a pandemic that has already killed more than 110,000 Americans and an economic crisis that is as bad as the Great Depression. While all Americans are affected by these crises, some are paying a far higher price than others. Black Americans and other minorities have suffered and died in far greater numbers than white Americans. And Blacks and Latinx have lost jobs and incomes at far greater rates than have whites. These disparities reflect the gaping inequities in our society, in education, in employment, in pay and in wealth, in access to healthcare, and in so much more. These inequities are in major part the result of systemic racism. The good news is that these problems are now being taken seriously by an ever larger number of Americans. Polls show that Americans by large margins see George Floyd's killing as the product of a systemic problems in law enforcement rather than as an isolated incident. And support for Black Lives Matter movements has also surged in the past 2 weeks. Tens of thousands of people of all races and ages have taken to the streets in hundreds of US cities to express their anger, vent their frustration, protest police brutality, and insisting that Black Lives Matter, and to demand real action and real change. That too is America today, and it gives us hope. For the past 100 years, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided a platform for fostering open and honest dialogue on difficult topics, including on issues of race and inequality. And we will do so now with a renewed commitment and energy in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. We will bring disparate voices to our platform, including especially the voices of those who have suffered so greatly, to ask questions, provide perspectives, and offer solutions. And we stand with those who say enough is enough. We need change, and we need it now. Today's discussion is part of our commitment to take a closer look at the deep fault lines in our society and point out ways in which these can be bridged. So I'm very pleased that we have an expert panel to kick off this critically important discussion, which will be moderated and led by our own distinguished fellow, Ertharin Cousins, to whom I now hand the floor. Ertharin?
Well, thank you very much, Ivo. And thank you to the 500 almost participants that have joined us today, especially to our members of the Chicago Council. I will remind you, this is an on-the-record program. If you'd like to submit a question to today's panel, please visit ccga.live. And as a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. It is now my great honor to introduce today's speakers. I'll start with Dr. Jonathan Metzl. Jonathan is the Frederick B. Rensselaer II Professor of Sociology and Psychiatry. He's also the Director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Metzl is the author of the book, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. It is available for sale through our partner, the bookseller. We also have joining us today Andrea Zopp, who serves as the President and CEO of World Business Chicago. Most recently, Andrea also served as the Deputy Mayor and City Neighborhood Development Officer for the City of Chicago. We'll be joined shortly by Dr. Helene Gayle, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Chicago Community Trust. Helene previously served as CEO of McKinsey Social Initiative and the CEO of CARE International. She also served in senior roles at both the CDC and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and again want to appreciate you for accommodating our change of schedule to ensure that this conversation respected the Floyd family. As those of you who are tuning in will recall, we were originally scheduled for yesterday at noon, which was unfortunately in conflict with the time of the homegoing service for Mr. Floyd. And we thought it in the best interest of not just the conversation, but as a respect demonstrated by the Council and today's participants for the family, that we move the conversation to today. So I thank you all for joining us. So let's get right into it. Evil has said it. The murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd have been a tipping point for many Americans in an especially difficult year. But these murders highlighted, again, the deep societal and systemic racism in the United States. And the title of today's conversation was very thoughtfully developed, Confronting Systemic Racism and Inequity. We knowingly use the word inequity rather than the term inequality, because inequity refers to unjust, unfair, and avoidable differences arising from poor governance, corruption, or cultural exclusion, while inequality simply refers to the uneven distribution of resources. So in the context of American institution and society, I'd like to start our conversation today by posing to both of you the question of, what does systemic racism mean? And how does the racial bias and systemic racism entrench America's racial inequity? Let's start by level setting on definitions. Let's start with you, Jonathan.
Well, first, let me just say how honored I am to be part of this conversation, and hopefully this is the beginning of an ongoing engagement, and hopefully we'll be able to meet in the real world and continue it down the road. I take my definition of structural institutional racism from Stokely Carmichael from the 1967, 1968, who in a moment somewhat similar to our own, kept being asked, what can we do to make people more aware? What can we do to make people more sensitive to the injustice? And Carmichael got frustrated with that question because he said, I don't know what's in people's hearts, and honestly, I don't care all that much. What I do care about is that there is racism that's embedded in our zoning laws, in our schools, in the way we designate neighborhoods, in our healthcare system, and all of these structures. And these structures are not so much the reflections of individual people's attitudes. They're the reflections of decisions we've made as a society about which which structures to support and which ones to not support, which communities are privileged and which ones are oppressed. And I think about that definition a lot in the present moment, because I do think this is a remarkable moment. And I do think a lot of people are waking up to questions of how can I change something I've probably been taught to believe for my entire life. But I also think that if we come away from this moment with just sensitivity and not thinking about the bigger questions of how can we change the structures in ways that work better for everyone, in ways that create more horizontal structures, doing that represents looking at just the ways that our structures have been built in ways that are oppressive. And I can go on and on about different examples of that. I'm coming from the context of medicine, where doctors for decades have been taught that to be racially aware is to be culturally competent, to be sensitive to the racial background of your patient. But none of that dealt with the bigger question of how health and illness result from all of these other neighborhood factors, food distribution factors, transit factors, all these things. And so in a way, it's time for our societies to start thinking structurally, because that's really what's needed right now, is a reimagining of the structures that create categories of privilege on one hand, and as you rightly say, inequity on the other.
Helene has now joined us, and Helene, we're answering the first question of level setting on definitions around systemic racism and racial bias and the entrenched issue and the entrenched result of racial inequities. And we want to talk about how those issues impact communities, helping define the issues, but also giving examples of how they impact communities. And why don't, Andy, if you'd like to respond, and then we'll go to Helene.
Sure, and I too want to just add to what Jonathan said around how privileged I feel to be participating in this really important discussion and really helping to thinking about trying to get to some of the underpinnings of the racism and the impacts. And so I'm a trial lawyer by trade, and so as a result, I tend to think in demonstratives and examples, and so I'll just give a couple of things that I think we can get that, and people need to understand that. Ivo touched on, our economic system was built on the back of a system that required people to believe that the people building that system were less than human. In other words, so you could treat them less than human, you had to believe. And that was embedded for hundreds of years. And then when you obliterated that system of slavery, you didn't obliterate the belief that the people were lesser. And many, many of our structures then were built around that. But just to give you more modern day examples, I will tell you two that I think are just really important for people to remember. So one is owning a home. Owning a home and the ability to buy a home if you were Black and to get a mortgage and that's a huge wealth builder for middle class Americans. But African Americans could not do it. In many places, they were banned from buying homes. Many of the communities that people talk about as, I had this fabulous community and we were all there and it was great and it was terrific, except Black people couldn't buy there based on the law, not because they didn't have the money. They couldn't access mortgages. And if anyone has read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on reparations, there's a big part of it around contract buying and selling. So you couldn't get a mortgage, you bought your house on contract. Which is a very different, you're not building up equity and wealth. And so as a result, African Americans didn't have that opportunity to build wealth and then hand that wealth down to their family. So that's just one systemic, and that was not just one community or a racist community, that was a federal government. You couldn't get a federal home loan. And then the other thing I tell people when I talk about this topic about systemic and understanding how embedded it is for us is to remember that it's not that far away. People tend to think the civil rights movement, we fixed it, we passed all these laws. Well, here you need to remember, I grew up Well, I was born and lived in a time when I was by law racial. I was lesser because I was Black. I grew up and I didn't grow up in the South. I grew up in New York State, and the laws were passed when I was younger. But the point was, when I was born, the white community around me, by law, was able to believe that I was less. We had to pass federal laws. And so you don't just, and the people who grew up in that world, whether they truly believed it or they've overcome it, are running things now. They're making decisions about who to hire and who to promote and who to invest in. And whether they consciously are aware that they grew up in a world that told them that brown people of a darker hue were lesser, they still grew up in that world. And most of them grew up in that world where brown and Black people were not present. So they had nothing to assess differently. If you think about it, most people who are running, majority people have not had a deep substantive experience with a person of color until they get into the higher realm. And that means they're led by their biases. It's not on purpose, not intentional, but it's there. And if you don't understand that, it's hard to overcome.
Mm-hmm. So I appreciate your example of a contract buyers league, the contract buyer, because my parents were were contract buyers and on the west side of the city of Chicago. And it was not until the contract buyers league and the lawsuits and after they'd paid on a house for over 30 years that they actually were given a deed to that house because they could not get a loan. And so
they didn't get the deed, right? The contract would be terminated. And I'm sorry, we're ending it.
No, eventually did. That was what but that's another, we'll have another webinar on that issue. But just wanted to add in my own personal, I want to go to you, Helene, because we've heard examples of racial bias as a belief and racism as what happens when that belief is acted upon, and examples of systemic racism being the institutions and the laws that supported that, as well as societal racism. But even when the laws are changed, the effects of the racism, because it has been structural, continue to plague communities, which is what we're seeing today. And I know the Chicago Community Trust is investing in this issue and helping communities address and overcome some of these issues. Can you speak specifically to not the symptoms that the Chicago Community Trust has identified, but the actual structures that you're working now to dismantle?
Yeah, thanks. And great to join this panel for this important discussion. And I would just want to add one thing on the contract buying discussion. There was a study that was released not long ago that showed that about $4 billion of wealth was stripped from the Black community as a result of redlining and contract buying. And so, to pivot to today, when we think about, when we go through these neighborhoods and say, gee whiz, I wonder why they are like they are, when you think about the cumulative effect of, all that we know, 400 years of slavery, discrimination, lack of access, but in our recent history, having something that had that catastrophic an economic impact on a community, I think you start understanding why this is such an important issue to address, because if we don't fix it, we are going to continue to deal with these issues. And so, today, as an example, there was a study that WBEZ just released that said that the lending of one North Side community was greater than all of the lending to the whole South and West Sides together. And it's some of the very banks and institutions that have made big pledges of investing in our neighborhoods. But, and so this has been a real wake up call. And I think it's that sort of thing where people, when we talk about and I know you talked a lot about systemic, the reason why it's so hard is that it is in the DNA of our structures. And it's not, and I think people continue to think this is about an attitude. It's about how I think about people. Well, it's partly that. And, as Andy said, it's how you hire, how you fire, what your biases are. But it's so ingrained in our system and in our structures that until we do that, we're not going to make a difference. So to your point, we about a year ago launched our strategy with a focus on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And here in Chicago, it's as gaping as any place in the world, and it manifests itself by the fact that we have the largest life expectancy gap of any city in the nation, and all the other implications. So we said that if we could have an impact on the racial wealth gap, then this would be a way of also addressing some of the other issues: violence, health, education, et cetera. And, developed a strategy where we will focus on 3 areas. One, how do you help increase wealth at the household level? So, as Andy was talking about, the ability to own home, the ability to get loans for small businesses, et cetera, all the things that help you to generate wealth. Income, yes, but income is a point in time. Wealth is something that stays with you, assets. So really focusing more on asset building. Then looking at how can we help to drive private investment in underinvested neighborhoods, because again, all the studies show that the investment in South and West Sides, particularly in some of the South suburbs and other places, woefully disparate when you compare it to white neighborhoods. And then how do we help to engage residents so residents are able to take actions on their own behalf, tell their own narratives, tell their own stories, et cetera. But along with that, we also said we would have an explicit focus on policy change, because we can do all of those things, but if we're not working on the kinds of policies that are pro-poor, help to look at ways in which you can help to provide financial security and address some of these inequities, then we're not going to have the kind of sustained impact that we want to. So we have said we will use our grant dollars, but we will also use our ability to help to shape policies, advocate for policies that can have a bigger difference in making a change. As an example, the kinds of things like expanding earned income tax credits could be hugely important in terms of financial stability. Some of the really I think promising legislation around baby bonds and other things that are a way of giving assets to young people so that you can start creating intergenerational wealth. So, those are some of the kinds of things that we're trying to do to address some of these issues. But I think it also has to go with addressing what we've all, I think now is so painfully obvious for everyone to see, is that the issue of racism itself also has to be attacked in the meantime.
That gets me, Jonathan, right to the question that after reading your book, I wanted to make sure we heard from you on, because we talked about this as structural racism. So we know we need to address structural racism. We need policies and actions that are anti-racial, not just addressing the symptoms of racism. But much of what Helene has just described are actions that the community can take to help the community pull themselves up, as was so often said, is no longer politically correct to say, but it was often, if people had the resources and they could pull themselves up. But the question of racism, and more specifically, white privilege, because many of my white friends will say, I am not racist. I don't discriminate, but we know that white privilege does play a role. And it must play, understanding white privilege and addressing that role must play a part in us overcoming the challenges of systemic racism. Can you define for us what is white privilege and why it's so important in addressing systemic racism?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, I think right now, this moment, certainly it's a moment for people to recognize their individual biases, their unconscious biases, but it's also a moment for people to realize the system that they're part of. In other words, exactly what Andrea and Helene were just talking about, that in a way, the system that's building up some people is keeping other people down. This is a moment where you recognize, oh my God, I thought I was living in this neutral place, but I'm living in an apartheid kind of place. And so in a way, recognizing the system that you are a part of is not just about your own self-reflection about your own bias. It's actually about recognizing the systems that might privilege you and unprivilege other people. And I think that really is the work that needs to happen right now. When I did my research, I did 5 years of research for the book Dying of Whiteness, and I traveled across Tennessee, Kentucky, Kansas, Missouri, and I encountered a lot of different opinions. I interviewed people about education, about healthcare, about guns, different issues, about policing also. And I certainly encountered a lot of overtly racist opinions. People who would tell me, for example, when I was interviewing people about the Affordable Care Act, that they didn't want to be part of a system that, to use a quote from a guy I interviewed in the book, he said, I know I need medical care myself, but I don't want to be part of a system that, as he said it, benefits Mexicans and welfare queens. People would tell me that again and again and again. This idea that basically it's a zero-sum formulation, and even if this system might help me, I'm not going to do it because it might also help them. And I encountered a lot of attitudes about that. And in a way, those kind of attitudes were underneath a bigger political story, which is that even if white people in those states might have been the most woke people on the planet, they were still living in a state who their government, the decisions that they had made, had decided, for example, to block Medicaid expansion or to not support the Affordable Care Act, which would have had dramatically beneficial effects for everyone, including communities of color. Or they supported budget cuts that eviscerated schools, public schools, that dramatically over impacted minoritized communities. I have met people exactly with what Helene was saying, who supported the brown back tax cuts, recognizing that those were, in a way, those tax cuts were upending any possibility of intergenerational wealth. Down it went. And so the point I'm trying to make is that over the course of these interviews, I met some people who told me really racist things, and other people who, as far as they understood it, with themselves were not racist. But as I started to aggregate the data, in a way, their individual attitudes mattered less than the fact that they were part of a system that was allocating resources in very disproportionate ways. And it led, as I show in the book, to dramatically different health, education, and lifespan outcomes. And so, in a way, this is a moment to think individually, to reflect individually, but these structural questions are important. And I'll just give one example of where I think things might be going in the right way. In my book, I do a lot of interviews in Tennessee, which decided to not expand Medicaid, which had horrific effects on minoritized populations in Tennessee. Kentucky, a couple of days ago, if they followed through on it, made a promise to give help, to basically expand Medicaid as much as they could. They've already done it, partner with private insurance, and actually provide health insurance for Black citizens of Kentucky. And so in a way, here's a way in which a structural wrong can be righted with the right policy in ways that might have, I think, dramatic downstream effects.
So those kind of dramatic changes that then create the dramatic downstream effects. I get really excited when I look at the protests from the last 2 weeks and see in many of these protests, you have more whites than blacks. And that's for the first time when these issues, the issues of protest in response to a murder, have taken place. So we can hopefully see that maybe as a sea change and a recognition of more woke white Americans saying that I'm part of this. But Andy, I want to go back to a question that an issue that Helene raised around generating Black wealth, and you are the CEO of World Business Chicago, which is a public-private partnership between Chicago and the business community. And among other things, the World Business Chicago focused on inclusive economic growth for Black people, specifically Black women. Yet, one recent statistic suggests 95% of Black-owned businesses failed to receive, either didn't apply or were found ineligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. And the same study noted that if under-resourced Black-owned businesses were able to reach parity with overall privately held firms in access to financial resources, it could create some 600,000 new jobs and add $55 billion to the US economy. So if those statistics are right, and you tell me if they are, what obstacles must government and private sector address to overcome this lack of economic opportunity represented by these statistics?
So those statistics are right, and I think PPE is and the program and how it initially launched is the perfect, to my point of graphic examples, a perfect example of systemic racism. Here's a program that on its face was eligible for open for everyone. If you had a business, all you do is apply. But the first round, basically Black and brown businesses and smaller businesses got cut out. And why was that, at least initially? Well, one of it was that the banks, first of all, that was the bigger banks that had bigger piece of the pie, not community banks, not CDFIs. They went to their customer base. Well, guess who's not in their customer base? Black and brown businesses and now that's a policy call, right? That's and then when they did start applying, they applied traditional guidelines, which may not apply to smaller businesses, rather than looking at how can we invest in these businesses and determine, and by the way, of course, it's a loan that's guaranteed by the federal government. So really why? But so the point is, that's a perfect example. So some of the things we have to do we have to recognize that you're starting with, when you're talking about how are we going to build wealth, how are we going to increase investments? You can't use the same standards, or worse, harder standards, right? When it came to, for example, for mortgages, still today, African Americans have a harder time getting mortgages because somewhere in that process, those numbers end up reflecting and impacting regardless of whether they come to it with the same level of income and experience. And so whatever algorithm they're using to decide is influencing, is impacting Black and brown people. And so you have to change the algorithm and look at the outcomes of what you're doing and be intentional. And this is really, I talk a lot about the idea of intentionality. Because if we just let systems, inherently racist systems, structurally racist, discriminatory systems act on their own, they will act in a discriminatory fashion. And so you have to be intentional around, you have to go to the outcome. If the outcome is we want to be able to invest in these communities, and you have to look at ways you can do that that will still support your business and your business goals, but also make sure that you're putting a fairer share of your dollars in those communities. So you have to, so there's an intentional thing. I mean, another example where it comes up all the time, if you talk to young people of color coming out of college, so educated, degreed, they're struggling finding jobs. Why? Because they apply on a database that uses algorithms, and algorithms that tend to, for example, because they look for things like internships and opportunities that many Black and brown people didn't have an opportunity for, because why? They had to work. So they had to go back to UPS or FedEx after school. They couldn't get the unpaid internship. But whatever it is, and largely those algorithms, by the way, are written by not written by people of color. When you think about AI, and you think about the people who are writing AI, and things that are assessing all kinds of things today, not written by people of, not many people of color engaged in making those decisions. And so what we have to step back and do is start saying, looking at the outcome. What's the outcome I want? The outcome I want is to drive more investment dollars in more equitably into communities that have not had them. And what are our systems doing that aren't allowing us to do that? Because it cannot be that those businesses can't function as well or as profitably, right? What are the outcomes? The outcomes are, I want to ensure that I'm hiring qualified students regardless of their, and more qualified students that are of color. So what are you going to do that if the resumes that are popping up to you are not included? And I think it is really asking ourselves in every process that we have, is it driving an outcome of equity? And if you're not, if you're looking at the outcome and it's not, there's a problem with your process and you need to revamp it in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Now, Helene, that gets us right into the next question I want to ask you. When we look at how are inequities being unveiled in communities, even though it's no longer the top headline, the battle against COVID-19 pandemic continues. And as we see now, some 20 states with increasing numbers to yesterday and today. And some have argued, and the evidence demonstrates, that this pandemic unveiled the inequities in America's health system. What role, if any, has systemic racism played in the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Black community? And how does racism, and particularly anti-Blackness, some would say, increase or create public health issues in the community? And I can't ask a question like this without also asking about what are the foundations for solutions to this issue?
So I'll jump to the solutions and then go back to the problem. But I think the solution, and I'll give a little more detail. But ultimately the solution is what we're all talking about. If we can make changes in a system that has been designed to keep a particular population behind, it will have all sorts of good effects, not just for Black people. It will have good effects for people of color, and it will have good effects for the rest of society. So ultimately, if we can solve this, we will have increased our economy, as Andy talked about. We will be fairer across the board. So ultimately, that's the solution. So the problem, yes, clearly racism has had a lot to do with health inequities, period. And I think COVID was a particular case in point. And it has impacted Black and brown communities disproportionately and in different ways. We're seeing the disproportionate number of new cases rapidly rising in the Latinx population, largely because of the occupations and the jobs that people hold, where they are in service industries that often make them at the front line of this pandemic. And so we have seen this astronomical rise in the Latinx community. We've also seen, particularly in the beginning of it, a very rapid rise among African Americans, but more, we're seeing a disproportionate death in African Americans, largely because of pre-existing conditions like diabetes, hypertension, other lung diseases that puts you at greater risk if you get COVID of having a serious outcome. In public health, we talk about this notion of the social determinants of health. Everybody thinks about decreasing health disparities by increasing access to health care. And we know that that's a problem. And we know that we do need to increase health care access through affordability as well as actual access to services, and that those services should be culturally appropriate, non-discriminatory, et cetera. But of the things that you have something to do with, so if you put genetics aside, which none of us can, ultimately change, of the things that you can do something about, only 20% of that is about healthcare. 80% are about what we call social determinants of health, whether you have a job, whether you live in a safe community, whether you have access to nutritional food, whether you have a good education, whether you have high quality water, clean air to breathe, et cetera. So all of these factors have a greater impact on your health outcomes than whether or not you have access to health care. So it goes back to the same thing. We've got to solve these other issues. And by the way, racism itself has an impact on health. And there's more and more studies that show that the stress of racism leads to what we call weathering. And it's just like a rock that sits out, and has the waves rolling against it, and eventually it erodes. The same thing happens when you are, as a person, exposed to this constant stress of racism. It has a physiologic impact on your body. So, a lot is known around that. And I think ultimately, if we want to have an impact on whether it's COVID, heart disease, cancer, et cetera, we've got to deal with these social determinants of health, which get back to this very topic of how do we really, truly, once and for all, tackle this issue of structural racism, because of the benefits of doing that accrue so broadly to our whole society.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, that issue of racism as having a multiplying effect on health issues. And I'm going to the questions now that we've received from our audience. And the first question says, racism and white supremacy won't die until white people see it as a white issue, which they need to solve, rather than a Black issue, which they need to empathize about. What educational work is required to overcome this dichotomy?
Well, this conversation is so fantastic, and I have so many thoughts in my mind based on what the other panelists are saying, that I'll try to organize it, except to say that I really agree with Helene's point, that just like racism is structural, anti-racism needs to be structural. And really the point being that if we start to fix the systems, I mean, think about it. We had this moment in the beginning of the pandemic, right? Where all of a sudden it became clear early on that minoritized Black and brown communities were at higher risk of getting sick and dying. And it wasn't clearly because of some genetic thing or something like that. It was because of all the issues that Helene was mentioning. And at that moment, it was like a decision that our country had to make. Was it that those people are dying, or was it that we are dying, that Americans are dying? And if it was, that wasn't the answer we took, but we can still take that. But if it's we are dying, then we are dying from social inequities, right? We are dying because of neighborhood effects. We are dying because of weathering or John Henryism. We're dying of all these other factors. And those are things that we actually can fix. And so in a way, this pandemic was a challenge to everyone to say that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And that in a way, never has it been more clear, even though of course it's clear if you're living in it every single day, but on an aggregate level, on a societal level, just the risk of creating these inequitable social issues. I'm on a team with the AMA, and we published a piece in JAMA last week that talked about what would it mean to reimagine medicine as part of a kind of structurally competent anti-racist project. And we came up with a bunch of different options. We thought about reimagining clinical care facilities in ways that made hospitals and clinics not just medical care facilities, but also clinics that would very broadly and powerfully address the social determinants of health issues, things like employment and immigration and access to internet, all these other factors. We also thought about reimagining communication systems, so democratizing information, working to disrupt some of the algorithms that Andrea was talking about, but also really figuring out ways to democratize access to healthy information and on down the road. And so all these factors. And the thing is, when we started writing this article, we realized that, of course, that would affect communities that are put at risk, but actually that would help everybody in a way. So this idea that basically better access to healthcare, better communication, more horizontal access, and in a way it proves what I think a lot of research has shown, which is that societies and communities where more people have a chance to succeed do better, right? More people are invested. Businesses that have more diverse voices around the table, they do better because they have different viewpoints about how to address complex problems like, say, a pandemic. And so in a way, from top to bottom, I think that all these things that were fixes, anti-racist structural interventions, they were things that actually would make the country better in a way by addressing these issues. And so really it's the question of the moment is, why are we holding on to this system that is kind of killing us all? I mean, in a way, this pandemic, we're all dying of whiteness in a particular way. And I think the moment is a challenge, and hopefully this moment, and thanks to the protesters, it can be an awakening to really seriously address some of these issues.
Hey, Earthrin, can I just jump in on that point? And because it's really important. It's not only will it make things better for everybody, but the costs of not are huge. There's a book called The Warmth with Other Suns that talks about the Black migration, but in that book, there's a quote where the author talks about the fact that it costs a lot to put your foot on someone's neck all the time. It costs a lot. If you think about criminal justice, think about how much money we spend incarcerating, keeping people in jail, and feeding them. Whereas if you took that money, a much lesser amount, and educated people so that they could come into and opened up those opportunities so that they could contribute back into the society, it's a huge benefit. And we could go down the list of things that where I say, you talk about it and you think this idea of it's us versus them, it's not my problem. It's a problem for brown and Black people, and they are going to have to fix it. And because I'm not racist, it's not my problem. Like, well, you're paying for it. You're paying for it, and because those dollars that you contribute are going to things that are not growing the economy, are not helping, and are not growing our tax base, because of that, we have lesser resources. We have lesser dollars for healthcare or for mental health care for everybody that has that impact. We have less dollars to pay for education, for higher education for everybody. And so the idea is we're spending dollars on keeping the boot on the neck of a population when we could be spending those dollars on uplifting everyone. And so the idea that this cost is only on one subject of the population is really false. It's a false dichotomy that we've created, that it's not our issue, it's their issue. It is our issue. The cost of violence. Part of my job here is recruiting companies to Chicago that come, they bring jobs. Well, when we have a huge violence problem, that impacts that and companies' willingness to come here, which impacts economic opportunity for everybody. But we can fix that. So, as I said, we could go down the list of everything where there's a huge cost, where it's just a misallocation of funds that we could improve the society for everyone.
Yeah, and there was a great study done called The Cost of Segregation, the Metropolitan Planning Council here in Chicago did, that showed that the cost of segregation. So if Chicago was just as segregated as the median, if you will, not totally unsegregated, but not as segregated as we are today, we would add billions of dollars back to our GDP, and that we lose about $4 billion just because of how segregated we are as a city. So there's, lots of information and lots of ways of looking at how this, how this hurts everybody. And it's been, one issue very specific to this moment, has been this debate about defunding the police. I think it's unfortunate that it's called that people talk about it as defunding, because I think people then think you're totally not going to have any force that looks at some aspect of public safety. But the reimagining of what public safety could be and what preventative measures could be, so that there wasn't as much need for a force that is about punishment versus how do you actually prevent some of these things in the first place, I think is a very interesting debate. And I think, it's one worth having. How do you reimagine what public safety is? How do you reimagine something that really focuses on, building assets in communities as opposed to clamping down on communities? And what would that look like?
Mm-hmm. This has been such a broad and rich discussion that I know we could go on for hours, but we have less than 10 minutes left. And so I'd like to go through a series of questions and ask you to give me less than 30, between 30 seconds and a minute to answer each one. So let's start with, do you see where corporations will now begin to partner more with Black businesses? And if so, how should they begin? Anyone?
So, I think not just Black businesses, Black and brown businesses. I think yes, but again, I think this is an area where most companies, major companies, have a policy around diverse spend. And again, I think it's rethinking that, because one of the things that happens now is that they have like a little piece of their pie and they go, okay, this is the pie that we're going to give to minorities and women, and then here's the rest of it. And the answer is thinking about it from a perspective, as some companies we're going to have a diverse spend of suppliers across our footprint, from whether it's professional services firms or architecture firms or across our footprint, and all of our suppliers will be, and that's going to improve our supply chain and our vendor plan. So you have to, instead of going, we're going to have a diversity program, here's our pie, thinking, how are we going to use our dollars to better invest and improve our supply chain and improve the community where we sit, communities that we impact.
Next question, how can we get more African Americans in senior leadership roles? And so I'd expand that to say African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans into senior corporate leadership roles. What's the how?
The how is to say that we're going to do it and set some goals and set some targets. It's real simple. The number of conversations I'm sure we have all sat in that says, well, we can't find enough, and we all know that's not true. There's a lot of incredibly qualified people out there. You have to ask the right networks. Two, there's always, this person isn't ready. The number of white males that I have seen put into positions who weren't ready and didn't do well, but that never stopped people from putting the next white male in. If you're a person of color or a woman, often, if you make one mistake, we took a risk on you, we'll never take a risk on another one again. So let's just get rid of all of that and say, we commit to whatever, call it quotas, call it targets, call it goals, but we set goals. And, companies are great at achieving what they set out to do. And if you make some goals and set some targets, you'll figure out how to make it happen. So I don't think there's a whole lot of complicated stuff that needs to happen. I think you just have to say, we're going to do it and make the commitment and get it done.
You know, if I could add to both of these questions, I mean, it's also the role of these self-perpetuating stereotypes, right? That I think both these answers are suggesting. So the idea of, oh, we just hired this one person and it didn't work, or there are not enough people or something like that. And in a way, it's all linked to the other systems of privilege and oppression that we've been talking about. And so I think that the reallocation, I'm coming from the academic and medical world, it's not just about corporate boards. It's also about commitment to education. It's certainly about how we allocate research funding to create the research knowledge. And so I think that just the minute that you start to think about how deep this goes, who's on the board or who's the CEO connects to, that's just the tip of a really, really big iceberg that ties into how we produce knowledge, right? And so I think I just want to advocate for universities and healthcare systems being part of that change as well.
Totally. And Eartha, one other way to look at it is if you, because we do this all the time, right? Black and brown people, we walk into rooms all the time where we're the only one. And we know, right? We notice. But majority of people oftentimes walk in the room where everybody looks like them and don't go, that's a problem. And this is that idea of intentionality. If you're running a company and you have a team, you walk in the team, everybody in there looks like you, that's a problem. Not just from a diversity, that's from a performance perspective about how you're going to be able to deliver. And we have to get to that level of sensitivity, which is to Helene's point. It's intentional. It's saying that's not how we're going to look because that's not how our world looks.
And just to add, I think this next generation coming behind us isn't going to accept it either. And so I think it becomes a business imperative because young people, they're not having it.
And seeing all these young people in the streets, speak to them. What should the next steps be for those who have taken to the streets, for the institutions, as well as for our government? What do you see as the necessary next steps to make progress from the actions we have witnessed over the past 2 weeks? Let's start with you, Jonathan. This is our last question.
Oh man, so much to say. I mean, I would first say that I think what we've witnessed over the past 2 weeks, it seems like it was just like people were coding it as just some organic rising up, but it's not. It shows the power of all the community work that's been done, the work that Black Lives Matter has done. What we're seeing is the effects of very hard coalition building over the years, and so partially, I think that we're being led by work that many of us, didn't know was happening at this level. And so in a way, I just think that I want to be led by what's coming from the protests in a particular way, as opposed to saying that I have some kind of top-down solution. But that being said, I've watched President Obama the other night on his town hall, and I thought he was remarkable in kind of making the point that part of this is about protest and part of this is about reimagining structures of change and how that works. And so I also think that as this happens, hopefully it leads to more engagement with decision-making, finances, politics, things like that, because I certainly know that white supremacy is not just about getting people to feel less than. It's about getting people to feel like the system doesn't work for them and get people to disengage. That's how this works. And so in a way, fighting against the system that tells them that their voice doesn't matter and getting engaged in changing these structures.
Andy, your advice.
Oops. I think, when we touched on this, we have to move away from this, there's still this defensiveness, right? When we talk about white privilege, and we have to move away from you're bad because you have white privilege. I was talking the other day, I have privilege because I have privilege because of where I sit in compared to communities that have been underinvested in. And so you can't be defensive. We got to get away from us versus them. And one way to do that is to educate yourselves about what we don't know. Don't be afraid to read the book, White Fragility. And because it's not going to say that there's something wrong with you, it's going to explain what has happened and how these systems are working. Understand about why some of these communities, why young men in some of these communities feel the need to join a gang or join a group or defend themselves or don't feel like they have a future. It's not because they're bad. It's not because they're criminals. It's not because they don't want more. It's because of these systems that we put in place. So I think stop feeling that there's something wrong with you or you're bad because you are white and privileged, because there's nothing wrong with you. You just have to start, there's more you can do to help. And for everyone, all of us, to spend time learning how we build those bridges.
And then you get the last word.
Yeah, I would say all of those, ditto to all of those things. I do think that the issue of policing needs to be addressed, because that's what kind of started this, and thinking about how do we, put in place policies around that so we reimagine what that looks like. I think that the kind of underlying issue around wealth inequality, which is such a driver for so many other issues, we need to think about some real major structural changes and ways in which we can, in fact, look at addressing this gaping inequality that's not going to go, that left by itself is not just going to make become fixed. And unless we do something, we know that the wealth gap is continuing to increase, not decrease. And unless we really do some structural things, that's not going to go away. And until some of that is fixed, we're going to continue to have some of these other issues. So, I think in addition to all those, and I would just totally ditto what Andrea said about educating oneself, because I think we are so woefully unaware of how we got to where we are. And until we understand that, I think people really continue to come up with solutions that don't fix the real problem.
I want to embrace everything that all of you've said, and I'm sure there's so many gems in those last comments, but reimagining and educating oneself, but also speaking out and speaking to others and sharing your self-awareness with those around you to bring others along, so that these are not issues that we're talking to each other, we're sharing and talking with everyone to make the changes that are necessary. This is the beginning of a dialogue. And I implore all of you watching, over 600 of you today watching us, to continue this dialogue. And so I want to thank you for allowing us to provide you with some information, but we also would suggest, as Andy and both Jonathan and Helene said, seek out other information and those conversations. So thank you for attending today. Thank you to my panelists for all of the wisdom that you brought to this conversation today. We could have gone on. I need to remind you that a recording will be available on our social media platform, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs social media platform. And we invite you to visit that, to visit the platform, and then push this conversation out on social media. Let it become a starter, a fire starter for conversations around the globe. I didn't get to all of your questions, but we will continue this dialogue. Thank you all.